Ridgefield was the kind of town where front porches held rocking chairs that actually got used, where the local diner knew everyone's usual order, and where children rode bicycles without helmets because danger felt like something that happened to other people in other places. Population 1847. Nestled between rolling hills and oak groves that turned amber every October. Laura Bennett had lived here for 12 years, ever since Michael brought her home as his bride. She knew the rhythm of this place, how Mrs. Henderson always walked her terrier at 6 a.m. sharp, how the church bells chimed every hour, how the streetlights flickered on 3rd Street, and needed replacing. But tonight, something felt different. Laura sat in her favorite armchair, the blue one by the window that Michael always teased her about, because it clashed with everything else. Her nursing degree from the State University hung on the wall nearby, a reminder of the career she'd paused to raise Tommy, 7, and Jake, 9. Both boys were finally asleep after an evening of homework battles and bedtime negotiations. Michael had complained of a splitting headache around 8 o'clock and retreated to their bedroom. Nothing unusual there. He'd been putting in 60-hour weeks at the accounting firm, trying to make partner before his 40th birthday next spring. Laura had brought him aspirin and a glass of water, kissing his forehead before dimming the lights. Now, at nearly midnight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The sound came from the kitchen, a soft scraping, like a chair being moved across linoleum. Laura's heart jumped, but she forced herself to think rationally. Old houses made noise. The Bennett place was built in 1952, and 60-odd years of settling foundation could explain all sorts of sounds. Still, she rose quietly and padded toward the back of the house in her slippers. The kitchen was empty, bathed in pale moonlight filtering through gingham curtains. Everything appeared normal: dishes in the drying rack. Tommy's art projects still spread across the table. The coffee maker programmed for 6 a.m., except the back door. It stood slightly ajar. Laura's mouth went dry. Michael was obsessive about home security, checking every lock twice before bed. She remembered him testing this very door after dinner, rattling the handle to make sure it caught properly. Through the gap, she could see into their backyard, the swing set Michael had assembled last summer, the vegetable garden she'd been neglecting, the old oak tree with the tire swing. Nothing moved except shadows cast by swaying branches. She pulled the door firmly closed and turned the deadbolt, hearing it click into place. But as she headed back to the living room, a chill ran down her spine. The air in the house felt different, somehow disturbed, as if someone had walked through it while she wasn't paying attention. "Michael?" she called softly, not wanting to wake the boys. No answer. She climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the familiar banister. Their bedroom door was closed, which wasn't unusual. Michael liked it dark when he slept. But when she eased it open, her heart nearly stopped. The bed was empty. Not just empty, untouched. The comforter lay exactly as she'd pulled it up that morning. Hospital corners crisp and precise. Michael's clothes from earlier were gone from the chair where he always draped them. With an edge of panic, she searched every room, the boys' bedrooms where they slept peacefully, the bathroom, the spare room they used for storage. She even checked the basement, though Michael rarely went down there because of his dust allergies. Nothing. Her husband had vanished. Laura's hands shook as she reached for the telephone. But what would she tell the police? That her husband wasn't in bed? That a door might have been opened? She had no proof of anything wrong, just a sick feeling in her stomach and a house that felt too quiet. She spent the rest of the night curled on the couch, watching the back door and jumping at every creak and whisper of wind. When morning came, harsh and bright through the windows, reality crashed down like a wave. Michael was supposed to drive the boys to school, did it every Wednesday, so Laura could work an early shift at the clinic. His coffee mug sat unused by the machine. His briefcase was gone, but his car keys hung on their usual hook. Laura called his office. "Brennan Associates, this is Michelle." "Hi, Michelle. It's Laura Bennett. Is Michael there yet?" "Oh, hi, Laura. No, he's not in. We figured he was running late for the Patterson appointment." "Should I have him call you?" "The Patterson appointment?" "At 9:30. He's been preparing for weeks. You know how important this client is for the partnership track." Laura felt the room spin slightly. Michael never missed important meetings. Never. Michelle? Did he say anything yesterday about going somewhere? Maybe a business trip? Not to me. Laura, is everything okay? You sound worried. That's when Laura knew she had to call the police. Detective Alan Pierce arrived within 20 minutes. A lean man in his late 40s with graying temples and kind eyes that missed nothing. He'd been with the Ridgefield Police Department for 18 years and had seen enough domestic situations to approach each one with both empathy and caution. Mrs. Bennett, I understand you're concerned about your husband's whereabouts. Can you walk me through the last time you saw him? Laura found herself studying Pierce's face as she recounted the previous evening. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook. When she described finding the back door ajar, his eyebrows rose slightly. And you're certain you and your husband locked his door last night? Michael always checks it twice. It's like a ritual with him. Pierce examined the door carefully, running his fingers along the frame. No signs of forced entry. The lock appears intact. He turned back to Laura. Has your husband seemed stressed lately? Any unusual pressures at work or elsewhere? He's been working long hours, but that's normal. He wants to make partner. Laura hesitated. Detective, this isn't like Michael. He's the most reliable person I know. He wouldn't just leave without telling me. Pierce nodded, making more notes. We'll need to search the house if that's all right with you. Sometimes people leave clues without realizing it. As Pierce and his partner, Officer Martinez, conducted their search, Laura called her mother-in-law to pick up the boys. She couldn't bear the thought of them seeing police cars in their driveway, asking questions she couldn't answer. The search revealed something troubling. Michael's hunting rifle, which he kept locked in a cabinet in the basement, was missing. So was the small revolver he'd purchased for home protection after a break-in 3 streets over last year. Mrs. Bennett, did your husband have any reason to take firearms with him? Was he planning a hunting trip? No, hunting season doesn't start for months. And Michael. Laura's voice trailed off as a horrible thought occurred to her. Detective, you don't think he hurt himself, do you? Pierce's expression remained neutral, but Laura caught something in his eyes, a flicker of concern that made her stomach clench. Let's not jump to conclusions. We'll check with local hospitals, his friends, anyone who might have seen or heard from him. Sometimes these situations have simple explanations. But as the day wore on, no simple explanation emerged. Michael's friends hadn't heard from him. His brother in Detroit knew nothing. His elderly parents in Florida were shocked by the news. It was as if Michael Bennett had simply evaporated into thin air. By evening, Pierce had assembled a small team. They'd found Michael's cell phone in his car, which was parked exactly where it should be in the driveway. His wallet was gone, but his credit card showed no activity since a lunch purchase the previous day. Mrs. Bennett, I need to ask some difficult questions. Were you and Michael having any marital problems, arguments, disagreements about money or the children? Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks. We weren't perfect, detective, but we were happy. Michael loved the boys more than anything. He never abandoned them. What about finances? Any money troubles? We're not rich, but we're comfortable. Michael's careful with money, sometimes too careful. We have a mortgage, car payments, the usual bills, nothing overwhelming. Pierce nodded, but Laura noticed him glance around the living room, taking in details she couldn't identify. What was he looking for? What did he see that she didn't? As the police prepared to leave, Pierce turned back to her. Mrs. Bennett, I want you to keep a record of anything unusual, phone calls, visitors, mail, anything that seems out of place. And if you think of anything else about last night, even something that seems insignificant, please call me immediately. He handed her his card, and Laura noticed his handwriting in the corner. Home, 555-147. You can reach me anytime, he said quietly, day or night. That night, alone in the house except for her sleeping children, Laura found herself retracing her steps from the evening before. She walked through each room, trying to remember exact details. Had she really locked the back door after dinner? Was she absolutely certain Michael had gone to bed with a headache? Doubt crept in like fog. Memory could be tricky, especially under stress. Maybe she'd been mistaken about the door. Maybe Michael had gotten up later, gone outside for some reason. But why would he leave his keys? Where would he go without his car? Around midnight, the same time she'd heard that sound in the kitchen, Laura found herself standing by the back door again. She opened it and stepped onto the small deck Michael had built 2 summers ago. The night was clear, stars visible between moving clouds. The swing set cast strange shadows across the lawn. And there, at the edge of the property line, she noticed something that made her heart race. Footprints in the soft earth near their vegetable garden. Large footprints, size 11 or 12. Michael wore size 10. Someone else had been in their yard. Laura spent the rest of the night with every light in the house burning, a kitchen knife within arm's reach, and her cell phone charged and ready. She dozed fitfully on the couch, starting awake at every sound. When dawn finally broke, she called Detective Pierce immediately. "I found footprints," she said without preamble, "in the backyard. They're not Michael's." Pierce arrived within 30 minutes, bringing a photographer and someone from the crime scene unit. They cast impressions of the prints and took dozens of photos from different angles. "Size 12 work boots," Pierce told her after the analysis. "Fairly new, based on the tread pattern. We'll run them through our database." "Does this mean someone took Michael? That he didn't just leave?" Pierce studied her face carefully. "Mrs. Bennett, we have to consider all possibilities. Your husband could have left voluntarily, and someone else made these prints at a different time. Or someone could have been watching your house. Or," he paused, "these could be connected to your husband's disappearance." The word he didn't say hung in the air between them. Kidnapping. Or worse. As news of Michael's disappearance spread through Ridgefield, Laura found herself at the center of attention she never wanted. Neighbors brought casseroles and awkward condolences. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with Michael's photo. Someone organized a search party for the weekend. But Laura noticed the whispers too. The way conversations stopped when she entered the grocery store. The speculative glances when she picked up the boys from school. Mrs. Patterson from down the street was the first to voice what others were thinking. "Laura, dear," she said over coffee, "you know how these things usually turn out when a husband disappears like this. Well, sometimes the wife knows more than she's saying." Laura set down her cup with a shaking hand. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with Michael's disappearance?" "Oh no, dear, of course not. But you have to admit, it's strange. No signs of struggle, no demands for money. Just gone." That night, Laura looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and wondered if guilt was written across her features for crimes she hadn't committed. Would people always suspect her now? Would her own children someday wonder if their mother had secrets? She thought about the footprints, the missing guns, the unlocked door. Somewhere out there, someone knew what had happened to Michael. Someone who wore size 12 boots and moved quietly through suburban backyards in the middle of the night. But whether that someone was friend or enemy, accomplice or predator, she had no idea. And 3 weeks after Michael Bennett vanished, Ridgefield had settled into an uncomfortable routine. Missing person posters bearing his photograph hung in shop windows and on telephone poles. The local radio station ran public service announcements twice daily, but the initial urgency was fading, replaced by something more insidious: speculation. Detective Pierce had expanded his investigation, interviewing neighbors, coworkers, and distant relatives. Michael's financial records showed no unusual activity. His internet history revealed nothing suspicious, just work emails, news sites, and occasional searches for lawn care tips. By all appearances, Michael Bennett had been a devoted family man with no reason to disappear, and no enemies who might wish him harm, which made his absence all the more puzzling. Laura tried to maintain normalcy for Tommy and Jake, but the strain was showing. The boys asked fewer questions now, as if they'd learned that some inquiries brought only tears and silence. Tommy had started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since age 4. Jake, always the serious one, had taken to drawing pictures of their family with an empty space where his father should be. "Mom," Jake asked one morning over breakfast, "is Daddy coming back for my birthday?" Laura's heart broke a little more. "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so, but privately, She was beginning to doubt her own hope. Pierce had been studying patterns not just of Michael's life, but of Laura's behavior since the disappearance. Grief manifested differently in different people he knew. Some became helpless, others hypervigilant. Some withdrew, others threw themselves into activity. Laura seemed to be fighting all these impulses at once. He'd observed her during interviews, noting how she answered questions. Direct inquiries about Michael received straightforward responses. But when Pierce asked about her own activities that night, what she'd been doing while Michael was allegedly upstairs with a headache, her answers became more detailed, almost rehearsed. "I was reading in the living room, a mystery novel, The Thursday Murder Club. I remember because I just started chapter 3 when I heard the sound from the kitchen." Pierce had checked. The book existed, and it was indeed found bookmarked at chapter 3, but something about the precision of her memory troubled him. In traumatic situations, people often remembered fragments, emotions, impressions. Laura's recollections were unusually complete. Then there was the matter of the property. Pierce discovered it almost by accidental land purchase Laura had made 18 months earlier. 5 acres on the outskirts of town with a small pond at its center. She'd bought it through a real estate trust, paying cash, listing her occupation as homemaker on the documents. When Pierce asked about it, Laura seemed genuinely surprised by his interest. "Oh, that, yes. I bought it as a surprise for Michael. He'd been talking about wanting a place where he could take the boys fishing, maybe build a small cabin someday. It was going to be his birthday present this year. You paid cash, $43,000. It was money from my aunt's estate. She died 2 years ago and left me some insurance money. I'd been saving it for something special." Pierce verified the inheritance. Laura's aunt had indeed died and left her exactly that amount, but something nagged at him. If the property was meant as a surprise gift, why had Laura visited it multiple times in the months before Michael's disappearance? Her car had been spotted there by a local farmer who used an adjacent road for equipment access. "I was checking on it," Laura explained, making sure no one was dumping trash or using it for parties. You know how kids are, reasonable. But Pierce made a note to visit the property himself. The pond was smaller than Pierce had expected, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by cattails and old-growth trees. The water was dark, stained with tannins from fallen leaves. Local kids had clearly been using it for swimming despite no trespassing signs. Beer cans and cigarette butts littered the shoreline. Pierce walked the perimeter slowly, looking for anything unusual. The soft earth around the water's edge showed footprints from multiple visitors, teenagers, most likely, based on the shoe sizes and tread patterns. But near the eastern shore, he found something interesting. Tire tracks from a mid-sized sedan, pressed deep into the mud. The wheelbase and spacing matched Laura's Honda Accord. More concerning were the disturbances in the vegetation areas, where cattails had been bent or broken, as if someone had been moving through them repeatedly. And there, half buried in silt at the water's edge, Pierce found something that made his pulse quicken: a spent shell casing. .38 caliber. Michael Bennett's missing revolver was a .38. Pierce called for a dive team, but the pond's murky water and accumulated sediment made searching difficult. After 2 days of systematic searching, they found nothing more conclusive than some rusted metal objects and a bicycle frame that had been there for years. But the shell casing was enough to obtain a search warrant for Laura's home and vehicles. The search yielded no firearms, no blood evidence, no obvious signs that anything violent had occurred. But Pierce's team did find something curious in Laura's bedroom: a collection of newspaper clippings about missing persons cases from around the state, dating back several years. When confronted, Laura had an explanation. "I started saving those after Michael disappeared. I wanted to understand. I thought maybe there was a pattern. Maybe someone was targeting husbands and fathers. I know it sounds paranoid." It didn't sound paranoid to Pierce. It sounded like research. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: traffic cameras. Ridgefield might have been a small town, but it sat at the intersection of 2 state highways, and the Department of Transportation had installed automated cameras to monitor traffic flow. Pierce requested footage from the night Michael disappeared, focusing on the routes between the Bennett home and Laura's pond property. And at 2:17 a.m., a Honda Accord matching Laura's license plate was recorded heading west on Highway 34, the road that led to the pond. At 4:43 a.m., the same vehicle was captured returning toward town. When Pierce showed Laura the footage, her composure cracked for the first time. I can explain this. I hope so, Mrs. Bennett. Laura took a shaking breath. I couldn't sleep. I was terrified, thinking about Michael being missing, imagining all sorts of horrible things. I thought maybe he'd gone to the property, maybe he'd found out about my surprise and gone there for some reason. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to check. You went alone in the middle of the night to a remote property where you thought your missing husband might be. I brought a flashlight. And Laura hesitated. I brought a gun. Pierce felt his pulse quicken. What gun, Mrs. Bennett? Michael's revolver, the one you said was missing. I found it in his car, under the seat. I took it because I was scared. You found the gun 3 weeks ago and you're just telling me now? I was afraid you'd think. I was afraid of exactly what you're thinking now. Laura led Pierce to her kitchen, where she opened a cabinet above the refrigerator and withdrew a .38 revolver wrapped in a dish towel. Pierce handled it carefully, noting that it had been recently cleaned and showed no obvious signs of recent discharge. But ballistics would tell a different story. When compared to the shell casing from the pond, the firing pin marks were a perfect match. Mrs. Bennett, Pierce said quietly, I need you to come with me to the station. As he read Laura her rights, Pierce reflected on how quickly a missing person case could become something much darker. The evidence wasn't conclusive. Laura could have fired the gun for any number of reasons, but the pattern was clear. Secret property purchase, middle-of-the-night visits, spent shell casings, and 3 weeks of lies by omission. The woman who'd sat in his office weeks ago, tearfully begging for help finding her missing husband, was now the primary suspect in his disappearance. The news of Laura's arrest spread through Ridgefield like wildfire. Neighbors who'd brought casseroles and offered support suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Had Laura been lying from the beginning? Was Michael Bennett buried somewhere in those dark woods around the pond? The local newspaper ran daily updates, and television news crews arrived from the state capital. The quiet town where nothing ever happened was now the center of a media storm. Some residents rallied around Laura, insisting that grief and fear could explain her seemingly suspicious behavior. Others, led by the persistent Mrs. Patterson, formed a different narrative entirely. I always thought there was something odd about that marriage, Patterson told anyone who would listen. Too perfect, if you know what I mean. And did you notice how quickly she cleaned out his closet? Who does that when they think their husband is coming home? Pierce tried to ignore the speculation and focus on evidence. But he knew that in a town like Ridgefield, public opinion could be as powerful as facts in a courtroom. During questioning, Laura stuck to her story. She discovered the gun in Michael's car and taken it for protection. She'd driven to the pond property that night because she thought Michael might have gone there. She'd fired the gun once into the air when something in the woods frightened her. What frightened you, Mrs. Bennett? I don't know. A sound, maybe an animal. I was already terrified about Michael being missing and being alone at night in that place. I just panicked. You fired the gun and then left? Yes. I felt foolish afterward. And you didn't think to mention any of this when we first interviewed you? Laura's attorney, a young public defender named Sarah Chen, interjected. My client was in shock, detective. She just lost her husband and was caring for 2 young children. Some inconsistencies in memory and judgment are understandable. Pierce wasn't convinced, but he had to admit that Laura's story, while suspicious, wasn't impossible. People did irrational things when they were frightened and grief-stricken. But then the dive team made another discovery. Returning to the pond with more sophisticated equipment, the divers found something they'd missed before: a canvas bag, weighted down with rocks, containing items that changed everything. Inside were Michael's wallet, his wedding ring, and a detailed handwritten note in what appeared to be his handwriting. I can't go on living with what I've done. Laura and the boys deserve better. Don't look for me. Pierce examined the note carefully. The handwriting looked authentic, but he'd need a forensics expert to be certain. More troubling were the contents of the wallet: Michael's driver's license, credit cards, and $347 in cash. Why would someone planning to disappear leave money behind? When shown the evidence, Laura broke down completely. That's not Michael's handwriting, she sobbed. He would never write something like that. Someone's trying to make it look like he killed himself, but Michael would never abandon us. Never. Never. Pierce studied her reaction carefully. Either Laura Bennett was an exceptional actress, or she was genuinely shocked by the discovery. But if she was innocent, it raised an even more disturbing question. Who else wanted Michael Bennett dead, and why were they trying so hard to frame his wife? As Pierce drove home that evening, he reflected on the case's strange evolution. What had started as a missing person investigation had become a potential murder case, then a possible suicide, and now something more complex entirely. The evidence against Laura was substantial but not definitive. The secret property, the late-night visit, the lies and omissions, all suspicious, but all potentially explainable by fear and poor judgment. But someone had fired a gun at that pond, and someone had planted evidence to suggest Michael had taken his own life. If Laura was innocent, then Ridgefield had a problem much larger than a missing husband. Someone was orchestrating events, manipulating evidence, and allowing an innocent woman to take the blame for a crime she didn't commit. The question was, who in this quiet, trusting town was capable of such calculated deception? The discovery of Michael's personal effects in the pond transformed the investigation overnight. What had been a missing person case was now officially a homicide investigation. And Laura Bennett, formerly a grieving wife seeking answers, was the primary suspect in her husband's murder. Pierce found himself working longer hours, reviewing evidence files that seemed to grow thicker by the day. The State Bureau of Investigation had assigned 2 additional detectives to the case, recognizing that Ridgefield's police department, capable as it was, had limited experience with potential murder cases. Detective Sandra Walsh, a veteran investigator with 20 years' experience, brought a fresh perspective to the evidence. She was particularly interested in the timeline discrepancies and the financial aspects of the case. Small town, single-income family, yet she had $43,000 in cash to buy a property. Walsh mused during a strategy meeting. Even with the inheritance, that's a significant expenditure for someone in their financial bracket. Pierce had wondered about this too. Michael's salary as a senior accountant was comfortable but not lavish. The family's expense mortgage, car payments, childcare costs left little room for major discretionary spending. She said it was meant as a surprise gift for Michael, Pierce replied. Anniversary present. Their anniversary is in October, Walsh noted. Consulting her files, she bought the property in February of the previous year. That's a long time to sit on a surprise. The forensic analysis of Michael's alleged suicide note raised more questions than it answered. The handwriting bore strong similarities to known samples of Michael's writing, but microscopic analysis revealed inconsistencies in pen pressure and letter formation that suggested forgery. It's good, the document's expert explained to Pierce and Walsh. Whoever did this had access to multiple samples of the victim's handwriting and considerable skill. But under magnification you can see hesitation marks places where the forger paused to check their work against a reference. Could Laura have done this? Walsh asked. Possible, but unlikely. This level of forgery typically requires training or extensive practice. Mrs. Bennett's background is in nursing, not art or calligraphy. The experts' findings supported Laura's insistence that the note was fake, but they also raised a troubling possibility. If Laura hadn't forged the note, who had? And why go to such elaborate lengths to stage a suicide? Meanwhile, Laura sat in a holding cell at the county jail, trying to process the nightmare her life had become. Her children were staying with Michael's parents, who'd driven up from Florida despite their advancing age and obvious bewilderment at the situation. I don't understand any of this, Michael's mother had whispered during a brief, supervised visit. Michael loved you. He loved the boys. None of this makes sense, Laura agreed. But saying so felt hollow. Nothing about the past month made sense. Michael's disappearance, the evidence at the pond, the planted suicide note, was as if someone had constructed an elaborate puzzle designed to destroy her life, piece by piece. Her court-appointed attorney, Sarah Chen, visited daily with updates that rarely brought comfort. The prosecution is building a circumstantial case, Chen explained during one such visit. They're arguing premeditation, that you bought the property specifically to dispose of Michael's body, that you lured him there under false pretenses, and that you've been lying about the circumstances from the beginning. But they don't have a body, Laura pointed out. How can they prove Michael is dead if they haven't found him? They don't need a body if they can prove he's dead and that you're responsible. The staged suicide scene, your secret visits to the property, the lies about the units, enough to build a case. Laura felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. Sarah, I need you to understand something. I didn't hurt Michael. Whatever happened to him, I had nothing to do with it, but I'm starting to think someone wanted it to look like I did. Chen had been thinking the same thing. While preparing Laura's defense, she'd noticed patterns in the evidence that seemed almost too convenient. The traffic camera footage that placed Laura at the pond at precisely the right time. The shell casing found in an obvious location after weeks of searching. The weighted bag containing Michael's effects, discovered just as public pressure for answers was mounting. Either Laura Bennett was exceptionally unlucky, or someone was manipulating the investigation. Chen decided to conduct her own inquiry, starting with the people closest to the case. She began with Detective Pierce, requesting a meeting to discuss the evidence timeline. Detective, I appreciate your thoroughness in this investigation, but I have some concerns about how evidence has been discovered. Pierce raised an eyebrow. What kind of concerns? The shell casing at the pond, your initial search was extensive. How did you miss it the first time? Crime scenes are complex. Small objects can be overlooked, especially in outdoor environments with changing conditions. And the bag with Michael's effects found just days after my client was arrested. Don't you find that timing suspicious? Pierce paused, considering. Ms. Chen, are you suggesting someone planted evidence? I'm suggesting that evidence has appeared at convenient times throughout this investigation. And I'm wondering if we should consider the possibility that someone wants Laura to look guilty. The conversation with Chen prompted Pierce to review the case from a different angle. Instead of assuming Laura's guilt and working backward from the evidence, he began considering who else might have had motive and opportunity to harm Michael Bennett. Michael's co-workers described him as well-liked but intensely private. He rarely socialized outside of work and had no known conflicts with clients or colleagues. His financial records showed no gambling debts, no suspicious transactions, no evidence of blackmail or extortion. But Pierce discovered something interesting in Michael's professional files. As a senior accountant, Michael had access to confidential financial information for several local businesses, including some of Ridgefield's largest employers. 6 months before his disappearance, Michael had filed a suspicious activity report with the State Treasury Department, flagging potential tax evasion by a local construction company. The report had triggered an investigation that was still ongoing. The construction company Hartley Brothers Construction had lost several lucrative contracts as a result. Pierce made a note to interview the Hartley brothers. James and Robert Hartley were third-generation Ridgefield residents who'd built their construction business into one of the town's largest employers. They were known for winning municipal contracts and had connections throughout local government. When Pierce visited their offices, he found 2 men who were clearly angry about Michael's report to state authorities. Bennett cost us nearly $1 million in contracts, James Hartley said bluntly, all over some paperwork discrepancies that were clearly just bookkeeping errors. You must have been upset with him, Pierce observed. Upset doesn't cover it, Robert Hartley interjected. But we're not killers, detective. We're businessmen. We fight our battles in courtrooms and city council meetings, not in dark alleys. Pierce noted their defensive tone, but had to admit their alibis for the night of Michael's disappearance were solid. Both men had been at a construction industry conference in the state capital, with dozens of witnesses and hotel records to confirm their presence. But the connection raised an important point. Michael Bennett, might have appeared to have no enemies. But his work as an accountant gave him access to information that some people would prefer to keep private. Chen's private investigation took a different direction. She focused on the physical evidence, particularly the items found in the pond. If someone had planted Michael's wallet and rings, they would have needed access to his personal effects. She obtained copies of the police inventory from the Bennett house and noted something odd. While Michael's wallet and jewelry had been found in the pond, other valuable items, his expensive watch, a gold tie clip, cufflinks that Lyra said he wore frequently, were missing from the house. If Michael had been planning to disappear or commit suicide, why would he take some valuable items but not others? And if someone had killed him, why dispose of some personal effects but not all of them? Chen also hired a private investigator to look into Laura's background more thoroughly. If someone was framing her for murder, they might have been watching the family for some time, learning their routines and vulnerabilities. The investigation revealed something troubling. Laura's movements in the months before Michael's disappearance had been documented by someone using sophisticated surveillance equipment. Phone records showed she'd received several hang-up calls. Her credit card had been cloned and used for small purchases that she'd attributed to fraud. Someone had been studying Laura Bennett very carefully. The revelation of potential surveillance changed the case's entire dynamic. Pierce obtained warrants to examine electronic records, including cell phone data, internet activity, and financial transactions for anyone connected to the Bennett family. The analysis revealed a complex web of connections centered around the Hartley brothers' construction company. While James and Robert Hartley had solid alibis, several of their employees and subcontractors didn't. Most significantly, Pierce discovered that Laura's pond property had previously been owned by a shell company with ties to Hartley brothers. They'd sold it to her for significantly less than market value, though the transaction had been handled through intermediaries who obscured the connection. They sold her the perfect place to dispose of a body. Walsh observed during a case review, then they made sure evidence would be found there. But why frame Laura specifically? Pierce wondered. If they wanted Michael silenced, why not make it look like a random crime or an accident? Walsh had a theory. Because Laura was convenient. She had access to Michael's personal effects, knowledge of his routines, and a believable motive if they could create one. Plus, framing the wife keeps investigators focused on domestic issues instead of looking at Michael's professional enemies. The evidence against the Hartley brothers was still circumstantial, but Pierce was beginning to see the outline of an elaborate conspiracy. Michael had threatened their business with his financial report. They'd responded not with violence, but with a sophisticated plan to eliminate both the threat and the evidence. By framing Laura, they'd ensured that Michael's death would be seen as a domestic tragedy rather than a professional assassination. The suicide note was meant to close the case quickly. But when that failed, the planted evidence at the pond would seal Laura's fate. But they'd made mistakes. The surveillance of Laura had left digital footprints. The forged suicide note was too perfect, and most damning of all, they'd underestimated the persistence of a small-town detective who refused to accept easy answers. Pierce knew he needed more concrete evidence before making arrests. But for the first time since Michael Bennett disappeared, he felt like he was finally seeing the truth hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. The question now was whether he could prove it before an innocent woman was convicted of a murder she didn't commit. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a teenage girl named Emma Rodriguez, who worked part-time at the gas station on Highway 34, the road leading to Laura's pond property. Emma had been following the Bennett case obsessively, partly out of morbid curiosity, but mostly because she developed a crush on one of the television reporters covering the story. When Detective Pierce appealed for anyone with information to come forward, Emma realized she might have seen something important. That night, the night Mrs. Bennett's husband disappeared, he was working the late shift. Emma explained nervously as Pierce interviewed her at the station. Around midnight, this big pickup truck came in for gas. Dark blue or black, really clean, expensive looking. Pierce leaned forward. Can you describe the driver? Big guy. Maybe 40-something. He seemed nervous, kept looking around like he was worried about being seen. He paid cash, which isn't unusual, but he was wearing gloves in April. That struck me as weird. Emma's description of the driver matched James Hartley perfectly. More importantly, surveillance cameras at the gas station confirmed a dark blue Ford F-350 registered to Hartley Brothers Construction had purchased fuel at 12:17 a.m. on the night Michael disappeared. Pierce felt his pulse quicken. The timeline was significant. If James Hartley had been at the gas station at midnight, he couldn't have been at the construction conference as he'd claimed. His alibi was falling apart. Confronted with the gas station evidence, James Hartley's composure cracked. He demanded an attorney and refused to answer further questions. But his brother Robert, perhaps sensing that their elaborate plan was collapsing, chose a different strategy. "I want to make a deal," Robert told Pierce during a subsequent interview. "I'll tell you what really happened, but I want immunity from prosecution." Pierce exchanged glances with Detective Walsh. They'd been hoping for exactly this moment when one conspirator would turn against the other to save himself. "That depends on what you have to tell us, Mr. Hartley," Pierce said carefully, "and whether it leads to finding Michael Bennett." Robert Hartley took a deep breath. "Michael isn't dead. At least, he wasn't when we last saw him." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Walsh leaned forward sharply. "What do you mean?" "He isn't dead. James lost his temper when that state investigation cost us the Morrison contract. Said Bennett had ruined us, that we had to do something before he filed more reports, but we never intended to kill him." "Then what did you intend?" Pierce demanded. Robert's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We were going to scare him, make him leave town voluntarily. We had connections people who could help someone disappear if they wanted to start over somewhere else." According to Robert's confession, the Hartley brothers had devised what they believed was a foolproof plan. They would abduct Michael, keep him hidden for a few days while they destroyed evidence of their tax irregularities, then give him a choice: leave Ridgefield forever, with a new identity and enough money to start over, or face the consequences of refusing to cooperate. "We never meant for it to go this far," Robert insisted. "The plan was to make it look like Michael left on his own, maybe had a breakdown or something. Laura would eventually move on. The kids would adapt, and Michael would be safe somewhere else, starting a new life." "But something went wrong," Walsh observed. Robert nodded miserably. "Everything went wrong. The brothers had been monitoring the Bennett family for months, learning their routines. They knew Michael's schedule, Laura's habits, even the children's bedtimes. When they grabbed Michael from his backyard that night, everything had seemed to go according to plan. But Michael Bennett proved more resilient than they'd anticipated. We kept him at the old warehouse on Industrial Road," Robert continued. "James thought a few days of isolation would break his spirit, make him more cooperative, but Michael kept insisting he'd never abandon his family. He said he'd rather die than leave his wife and children thinking he'd deserted them." Pierce felt a chill. "Where is Michael now, Mr. Hartley?" "I don't know. That's the truth, I swear. After 3 days, James came to me and said there'd been a problem, that Michael had tried to escape and things had gotten out of hand." "What kind of problem?" Robert's voice became barely audible. "James said Michael was dead. Said it was an accident, that Michael had fallen and hit his head while trying to get away, but I never saw the body. James handled everything after that." Walsh and Pierce exchanged significant looks. If Robert was telling the truth, James Hartley was the only person who knew what had really happened to Michael Bennett. The warehouse Robert had mentioned was still owned by Hartley Brothers Construction, though it hadn't been used for business purposes in years. Pierce obtained a search warrant immediately, bringing along a full forensic team and cadaver dogs. The building was a cavernous space filled with old equipment and construction materials. But in a small office at the back, the dogs immediately alerted to something significant. Luminol testing revealed extensive blood evidence, despite obvious attempts to clean the area. DNA analysis would take time, but Pierce was confident they'd found where Michael Bennett had been held and possibly where he'd died. But Robert Hartley's claim that he didn't know where Michael's body was located presented a significant problem. Without remains, the case against James Hartley would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and his brother's testimony. Pierce needed to find Michael Bennett. Meanwhile, news of the arrests had spread through Ridgefield like wildfire. Laura Bennett, still in custody, pending her trial. learned about the developments from her attorney Sarah Chen. "The charges against you will be dropped," Chen explained during an emotional meeting at the jail. "The prosecution's case has completely collapsed. You'll be released within the hour." Laura wept, openly, partly from relief, but mostly from the realization that Michael was almost certainly dead. For weeks she'd clung to the hope that he might still be alive somewhere, that somehow this nightmare would end with his return. Now she had to face the reality that her husband was gone forever, and that their children would grow up without their father. "I need to see Tommy and Jake," she said through her tears. "They must be so confused, so frightened." Chen nodded sympathetically. "Your in-laws have been taking good care of them. But yes, they need their mother." As Laura prepared to leave jail, she thought about the elaborate conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her life. Someone had watched her family for months, studied their vulnerabilities, and then exploited them with ruthless efficiency. The betrayal felt almost as devastating as Michael's death. James Hartley's arrest made national news. The story had everything journalists loved: a small-town conspiracy, an innocent woman nearly convicted of murder she didn't commit, and a victim who remained missing despite extensive searches. But Pierce wasn't interested in media attention. He was focused on one thing: finding Michael Bennett's body and bringing closure to his family. Interrogating James Hartley proved frustrating. Unlike his brother, James had hired an expensive criminal defense attorney who advised him to remain silent. He refused to discuss Michael's fate, the location of his remains, or any details about the conspiracy. "My client maintains his innocence," the attorney stated during a brief press conference. "The allegations against him are based entirely on the uncorroborated statements of his brother, who is clearly trying to save himself by shifting blame." Pierce knew that wasn't true. The physical evidence was overwhelming. But without Michael's body or confession, securing a murder conviction would be challenging. The search for Michael Bennett's remains became the largest missing person investigation in Ridgefield's history. Volunteers joined law enforcement officers in combing through forests, abandoned buildings, and construction sites throughout the region. Ground-penetrating radar was used to examine potential burial sites. Cadaver dogs were brought in from 3 states. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of James Hartley to help predict where he might have disposed of a body. But days turned into weeks with no significant discoveries. Pierce began to wonder if they would ever find Michael Bennett. The psychological impact on his family was devastating, knowing he was dead, but having no body to bury, no grave to visit, no sense of closure. Laura had returned to her nursing job at the local clinic, trying to rebuild a normal life for herself and her children. But the trauma of the past months had left visible scars. She was more cautious, more suspicious of strangers, more protective of Tommy and Jake. "I keep expecting him to walk through the door," she confided to Pierce during one of his follow-up visits. "Even knowing he's gone, part of me still hopes this is all some terrible mistake." The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: satellite imagery. A geography professor at the state university had been following the case and offered to help analyze aerial photographs of the region. Using advanced software, she was able to identify areas where ground disturbance had occurred in the months following Michael's disappearance. One location immediately caught Pierce's attention. A remote section of forest about 15 miles from Ridgefield, adjacent to property owned by Hartley Brothers Construction. The satellite images showed tire tracks leading to a clearing where the earth appeared to have been recently disturbed. Trees had been damaged, possibly by heavy equipment. Most significantly, the disturbance had occurred just days after Michael Bennett's disappearance. Pierce organized another search team, this time focusing specifically on the satellite location. The forest was dense and difficult to navigate, but the search dogs immediately showed interest in the clearing identified from the aerial photographs. Ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly about 6 feet below the surface, roughly the size and shape of a human body. Pierce felt his heart racing as the excavation team began carefully digging. After months of frustration and false leads, they might finally be close to finding Michael Bennett. 3 feet down, they encountered a layer of limea substance, often used to accelerate decomposition and mask odors. At 4 feet, they found fragments of clothing. At 6 feet, they uncovered what they'd been searching for. Michael Bennett's remains were finally found. The medical examiner's preliminary examination revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with Robert Hartley's claim that Michael had died from a head injury. But the position of the body and the careful burial suggested that Michael's death hadn't been accidental. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to conceal the remains. With Michael's body recovered and forensic evidence linking James Hartley to the murder, the case finally began moving toward resolution. James's expensive attorney started making overtures about a plea bargain, recognizing that his client's position had become untenable. But Pierce wasn't interested in deals. James Hartley had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy that had nearly destroyed an innocent family. He'd murdered a man whose only crime was doing his job honestly, and he'd shown no remorse throughout the investigation. "He's going to trial," Pierce told the prosecutor. "Michael Bennett's family deserves justice, and this community deserves to see that elaborate conspiracies don't pay." Laura Bennett finally had the closure she needed. Her husband's body could be laid to rest, her children could begin processing their grief properly, and the shadow of suspicion that had hung over her for months was permanently lifted. But the scars would take much longer to heal. And the courthouse steps were crowded again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Where once there had been whispered speculation about Laura Bennett's guilt, now there was a palpable sense of anticipation for justice. The media attention had intensified as details of the Hartley brothers' conspiracy became public, transforming a local tragedy into a cautionary tale about corruption and the lengths some people would go to protect their interests. Detective Alan Pierce arrived early, as had become his habit during the investigation. The folder he carried was thicker now, filled with forensic reports, witness statements, and photographic evidence that painted a clear picture of premeditated murder and elaborate cover-up. Laura Bennett sat in the gallery with her sons, who were now old enough to understand that their father wasn't coming home, but still too young to fully grasp the complexity of what had been done to their family. Tommy, now 8, held tightly to his mother's hand. Jake, 10, sat straighter, trying to project a maturity that broke Laura's heart. Michael's parents had flown in from Florida, their faces itched with grief, but also with gratitude that their son's killer would finally face justice. The past months had aged them considerably, but they'd found strength in supporting Laura and their grandsons through the ordeal. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Margaret Foster, had prepared meticulously for this trial. Unlike Laura's case, which had relied on circumstantial evidence and speculation, the case against James Hartley was built on a foundation of physical evidence, witness testimony, and documented conspiracy. Foster began her opening statement with a simple but powerful declaration. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about what happens when greed and desperation drive supposedly civilized people to commit the most uncivilized act possible: murder." She outlined the evidence methodically. Michael Bennett's financial investigation that threatened Hartley Brothers construction, the elaborate surveillance of the Bennett family, the carefully orchestrated kidnapping and murder, and the sophisticated attempt to frame an innocent woman for her husband's death. "The defendants didn't just kill Michael Bennett," Foster continued. "They tried to destroy his family by making his wife appear responsible for his death. They weaponized this community's trust and turned it against a grieving mother and her children." James Hartley's defense attorney, a seasoned criminal lawyer named Marcus Webb, faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence was overwhelming. His client's brother had provided detailed testimony about the conspiracy, and public opinion had turned decisively against his client. Webb's strategy focused on portraying James as a man who'd made increasingly desperate decisions as his business faced ruin, suggesting that Michael's death had been accidental rather than premeditated murder. "My client is guilty of poor judgment, of panic, of trying to cover up a tragic accident," Webb argued. But he is not a cold-blooded killer who set out to destroy the Bennett family. The first week of testimony established the timeline and motive for the crime. Pierce took the stand to describe the investigation, the discovery of Michael's remains, and the forensic evidence linking James Hartley to the murder. Emma Rodriguez, the gas station attendant whose observation had cracked James's alibi, testified about seeing him purchase fuel on the night of Michael's disappearance. Her nervousness was evident, but her account was clear and credible. He seemed really anxious, she told the court. Keep looking over his shoulder, like he was worried about being seen. That's why I remembered him so clearly. The forensic experts presented overwhelming physical evidence. DNA from Michael's blood was found in James Hartley's truck, despite obvious attempts to clean it. Soil samples from Michael's burial site matched dirt found in the truck's bed. Cell phone data placed James in the vicinity of both the Bennett home and the burial site on the night of the murder. But the most damaging testimony came from Robert Hartley himself. Robert had aged visibly since his arrest, his face drawn and his voice hollow, as he described his brother's descent into desperation and violence. He detailed the months of surveillance, the planning sessions, and the night everything went wrong. Well, James convinced me we were just going to scare Michael, make him understand that his reports were hurting innocent people or employees, their families. Robert testified. I know how it sounds now, but at the time, James made it seem almost reasonable. Under cross-examination, Webb tried to discredit Robert's testimony by emphasizing his plea agreement and his motivation to shift blame to his brother. But Robert's account was supported by too much physical evidence to be dismissed. My brother told me Michael tried to escape on the third night, Robert continued, his voice breaking. Said there was a struggle, that Michael fell and hit his head. But when I saw how much blood there was in that office, I knew it hadn't been an accident. What did you do then? Foster asked. Nothing. God help me. I did nothing. James said he'd handle it, that we'd already gone too far to turn back. So I stayed quiet while he buried Michael in those woods and planted evidence to frame Laura. The revelation of the elaborate frame-up particularly outraged the jury. Details emerged about how James had obtained samples of Michael's handwriting to forge the suicide note, how he'd planted the shell casing at the pond property, and how he'd ensured that Laura's movements would be captured on traffic cameras at incriminating times. It was all calculated, Robert explained. James said framing Laura was perfect because it would make Michael's death look like a domestic situation. No one would look at his business enemies if his wife appeared to be guilty. The prosecution also presented evidence of the financial motive behind the crime. Michael's report to state authorities had triggered an investigation that cost Hartley Brothers Construction over $2 million in lost contracts. Several other clients had canceled projects once the tax evasion allegations became public. Michael Bennett's integrity cost these defendants their livelihood, Foster argued. So they decided his integrity would cost him his life. The defense called few witnesses, recognizing that their best strategy was to minimize James's culpability rather than deny his involvement entirely. Webb presented character witnesses who testified to James's previous good standing in the community and his role as an employer who'd provided jobs for dozens of local residents. James Hartley is not a monster, Webb argued in his closing statement. He's a man who made terrible choices when faced with the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. Yes, he's guilty of causing Michael Bennett's death, but this was not premeditated murder. It was a series of increasingly desperate decisions that spiraled out of control. But Foster's rebuttal was devastating in its simplicity. The defendant had multiple opportunities to stop this conspiracy. When he decided to kidnap Michael Bennett, he could have stopped. When Michael refused to cooperate after 3 days of captivity, he could have released him and accepted the consequences. When Michael died, whether accidentally or intentionally, could have called the police and told the truth. She paused, looking directly at the jury. Instead, at every decision point, James Hartley chose to go deeper into deception and cruelty. He chose to bury Michael's body in a remote forest. He chose to forge a suicide note. He chose to plant evidence that would frame an innocent woman for murder. These weren't panic decisions made in the heat of the moment. They were calculated acts of evil designed to destroy not just Michael Bennett but his entire family. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with their verdict. James Hartley was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, and multiple charges related to evidence tampering and fraud. When the foreman read the verdict, the courtroom erupted in applause before the judge gavelled for order. Laura Bennett wept quietly, finally able to release months of suppressed emotion. Her children, though they didn't fully understand the legal proceedings, seemed to sense that something important had been resolved. During the sentencing phase, Laura was given the opportunity to address the court. She stood slowly, her voice initially shaky but growing stronger as she spoke. "James Hartley didn't just kill my husband," she said. "He tried to kill everything Michael stood for: honesty, integrity, devotion to family. He tried to make me complicit in my own husband's murder by framing me for a crime I didn't commit." "Yeah." She paused, looking directly at James, who sat impassively at the defense table. "But he failed. Michael's legacy lives on in our children, who will grow up knowing their father died because he refused to compromise his principles. And our community has learned that truth, no matter how carefully buried, will eventually come to light." Judge Harrison sentenced James Hartley to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert Hartley, in exchange for his cooperation, received a sentence of 25 years with the possibility of parole after 15. As the defendants were led away, Pierce felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't restore Michael Bennett to his family or undo the trauma they'd endured. The detective approached Laura as she prepared to leave the courthouse with her children and in-laws. "Mrs. Bennett," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for the suspicion you faced during the investigation. I hope you understand that we had to follow the evidence wherever it led." Laura shook his hand warmly. "Detective Pierce, you found the truth when it would have been easier to accept the lie." Michael would have appreciated that. In the weeks following the trial, Ridgefield began the process of healing from the trauma that had divided the community. The case had exposed how quickly suspicion could turn neighbors against each other, but it had also demonstrated the importance of perseverance in seeking justice. Pierce returned to his regular duties, but the Bennett case had changed him. He'd learned not to trust convenient explanations or obvious suspects, and he'd developed a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human behavior under extreme stress. Laura and her children slowly rebuilt their lives. She returned to nursing full-time, finding purpose in caring for others as she'd been cared for during her darkest hours. Tommy and Jake began counseling to help them process their father's death and their mother's ordeal. The pawned property, which had been the center of so much deception, was eventually sold. Laura used the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Michael's memory for students pursuing accounting or criminal justice degrees, a fitting tribute to a man who died for his commitment to truth and integrity. On the first anniversary of Michael's murder, Laura organized a memorial service that drew hundreds of community members. Pierce attended, along with many of the law enforcement officers who'd worked the case. During the service, Laura spoke about forgiveness, not for James Hartley, who'd shown no remorse for his crimes, but for the community members who doubted her innocence. "Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do," she said. "It made James Hartley commit murder, and it made some of our neighbors believe I was capable of killing the man I loved. But fear also brought out the best in many people, the detectives who wouldn't give up on finding the truth, the lawyers who fought for justice, the friends who stood by us when everything seemed hopeless." She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. Michael believed that truth was more important than convenience, that doing the right thing mattered more than taking the easy path. That's why he filed those reports that ultimately cost him his life. And that's why we're all here today, because truth, however painful, is always better than a comfortable lie. As the memorial service concluded and people began to disperse, Pierce found himself walking alone through downtown Ridgefield. The town looked the same as it had before Michael Bennett's disappearance, but he knew it had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past year.